And I think that based on the different land grants that they came from or the pedigrees, you know, different ryes are going to perform well in different parts of the upper Midwest. We've really liked Danco. It's given us a lot more yield and stands a lot better than a Rustic certainly did. And we do, at least for our farm, we found that the yield bump on the hybrid rye for us wasn't enough that the benefits of, you know, having our own seed to save didn't outweigh that. The year that we did grow the hybrid rye was 2018, which was a miserable small grain year where we were, and so maybe it wasn't the best. We didn't necessarily give the hybrid rye a fair shake, and we also made a few mistakes in terms of some of the points I have up here. We certainly didn't plant early enough. This is actually something that Tor, who's speaking next, told me last fall, and somehow I didn't realize this, but that rye primarily tends to tiller in the fall. So even though rye is tough as nails, and you think, oh, well, let's save that till the end because it'll survive the winter, you're giving up a lot of yield potential by doing that necessarily. So instead of kind of, on our farm, rye tended to go in around the 15th of October after everything else had gotten in. This year we did it around the 15th of September and planted the winter wheat after that. The second key thing is that rye likes to be planted much more shallow than winter wheat or other cereals. I think in general we shoot for about a ½ inch maximum depth on rye. And I don't really know the science behind it, but I've been told by enough people at this point that that's also a real key in yield potential, is to keep the planting shallow. In our system, we found that frost seeding red clover into it actually works really well. It is a crop that we don't need to swath usually, which is a double benefit because obviously it makes harvest more timely, but also the one time we did try to swath rye, it was physically too tall for the opening in the swather and really slowed us down. So, and obviously the straw is highly marketable, even in comparison to other small grains, usually because of its cleanliness, and especially if you have anyone in your area that's using it for vegetables or for mulch, there is some belief that there's some carryover of the allelopathic effect in the mulch. I can't speak to whether that's scientifically valid, but I've talked to quite a few vegetable farmers that certainly believe it. Open pollinated corn. We grow 3 different open pollinated corns, yellow flint, a hard red flint, and then a white dent. All of them are composites. We inherited the genetics basically from composites that were started, I think, well over a decade ago. We've been selecting them for 3 or 4 years on our farm. And so when you hear about Bloody Butcher or Jimmy Red or Hickory King or Floriani Flint and all of these heirlooms that have a lot of marketing cachet, this isn't, nothing we grow has any of that pedigree, but it all contains all of that genetics in some point or another, and sometimes it'll spit ears that follow those profiles. But I'm actually really grateful that we've started from composites because it gives you an opportunity to be a lot more flexible. You're not necessarily trying to maintain the integrity of an heirloom. You're trying to adapt the genetics to succeed on your farm. And each of these ones we select for a different end user, basically. When we're selecting, we're focusing a lot more. I mean, there are physical characteristics in the ears and ear size and kernel counts and things like that, but a lot more of it has to do with plant health at this point, and balancing an ideal ear with a variety of characteristics that you want to keep in the seed. I would say, in our experience, hand selection is really necessary. I try to pick, I don't know, 4 or 5 bushel. It takes me usually about a good day to do a good job of it, of each variety. And I tend to do it in early October or mid-October. I think probably if I were to be a little bit more rigorous about it, I would go tag plants, you know, earlier in the season to look for different characteristics earlier on, but it hasn't been really practical or feasible on our farm to do that. I've really struggled with our varieties to have them dry down in southwest Wisconsin in any reasonable way. So we've had to be a little bit more creative in drying because, again, when we're planting low acres, these corns tend to only yield 50 bushel, give or take. You know, a value-added market's really key. And so we and this is an idea that we got from Josh Engel, who has one of these. We took an old barge box wagon, put a grain bin floor in it, and then attached a fan, and we could take 8 points of moisture off in a week, which on a lot of 250 bushels of corn or something like that, where it's too small for a bin. I mean, it would work in a bin, but it's a lot of work to clean it and all that. And those screw-in fans that you can get are pretty much worthless when you're dealing with that kind of moisture. This is again talking about what we tend to select for. This is the white dent and some of the red flint sitting on our basement floor now, drying. Stalk strength is huge. The zero tolerance for that. If it's a tipped over plant but a beautiful ear, I'll skip that ear no matter what. And I try to select for loose husks and downturned ears, because that is really closely correlated with it drying down in a timely way. If you have a really tight ear with kernels exposed that's pointed upward in the middle of October, no matter how big or beautiful that ear is, it's not one that you want to keep. So marketing for both of these, I'll just really briefly, they're both a challenge to market. Rye, there's a market for cover crop seed, but we learned this last year, in wet years, you don't always have the germ to make that. Food grade, the problem is this is a loaf of the Vollkornbrot, the whole grain sourdough rye that is really popular in Northern Europe, not so popular in the upper Midwest, despite the fact that so many of our ancestors, this is our, it's in our heritage, but we've lost the palate for it. So we're certainly pushing to get bread like that back in the mainstream, but it's a challenge. Distillery is obviously a big market, but that's still pretty small, especially when you look at the percentage of even craft distilleries that are certified organic and will pay that premium. Open pollinated corn the same way. It's really, it can be really beautiful corn. The trade, and there's obviously, if you're direct marketing the way we are, it's really easy to get a chef or someone excited about this corn that's totally unique, and especially the flinty corns make a really nice polenta and things like that. But with the low yields, if you don't have the market lined up, selling it for feed is obviously a real killer. So with any of these specialty grains, and I think this speaks for everybody else on the panel, one of the biggest tricks is not really in field management, but understanding where your market is once you get it off the field. So there's potential there, but again, there's a lot of work on the marketing side. With the corn characteristics in particular, the flint corns we grow, those are much higher protein and they have more of the actual hard grit in them and a lot less of the corn flour or starch. So they're really good for milling, but if you're trying to sell for a masa or a distilling market, they don't want that high protein, low starch, they want the opposite, because that makes higher efficiency when they're making booze. So depending on what your end user is, your beautiful open pollinated corn, if it's a really flinty corn, it's not going to make good whiskey. It's not going to make good tortillas. And in the inverse, obviously, if you have the white dent we have, I wouldn't really use that as much for a milling market, not because the flavor's not there, but because you lose a tremendous amount of it when you sift off the corn flour when you're doing polenta. So this is something I added really quick, and I know I'm at the end, but I did want to call out in case anybody has any questions about ancient grains. We're not really touching on that, but we do grow primarily spelt and dehull it on our farm, which has its other whole host of challenges. But if anybody is curious about that, I'm happy to answer questions there too. But otherwise, I'll pass it off to Tor and go down the line.